Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a frontline update for the 12th of February 2023. Let's go to a couple of discussion points from the ISW before we go to the front lines. And I mentioned this in my news a little bit. So Ukrainian military officials, so Ukrainians and Russian pro-war nationalist voices are downplaying Russia's ability to launch a sweeping large-scale offensive in Donetsk Oblast in the current circumstances of the Russian armed forces. And this might be as a result, as it goes on to say, of the culmination that's taking place around Vuhledar and the loss of all the equipment that we've seen. And that has weakened the Russian and ultra-nationalist community's belief that Russian forces are able to launch a decisive offensive operation. The disparity between the limited but significant Russian advances in the Bakhmut area and the lack of meaningful advances elsewhere in Ukraine may support the Mill blogger and Ukrainian observations that Russian forces are able to secure rapid advances through traditional mechanized maneuver warfare. It's really fascinating that indeed things, if the offensives really have started, then they have been a real stuttering start. There is a little bit of movement around Kreminna, there's a little bit of movement around Kupiansk, but not significant really. And it doesn't look like they've got the forces or material to do a massive attack unless there's a whole load kept in secret. We shall see whether they're going to send a load of mobilized forces to the front line or whether they've actually been sending them in dribs and drabs. But where the Ukrainians were thinking there was going to be a huge offensive brewing, they've now downplayed it to, well, we're not sure they've actually got the capability and capacity to produce a huge counteroffensive. It might be, a lot smaller than that. In other news relevant here, the Wagner mercenaries seem to be being sidelined much more, and Prigozhin is approaching an Igor Girkin kind of position of being very critical of the Russian military, so Ministry of Defense military decisions, and that kind of rhetorical approach might get him in trouble. Or it seems already that he's in trouble. He might think that he's got nothing to lose by going all in, rhetorically speaking, because it does appear that Wagner are taking more of a back seat. Okay, let's go to the northeast, which is the Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna front line, and we'll go first to Kupiansk area. Let's look at it on my map, which looks something like this. So you've got Kupiansk there, Svatove here, Kreminna down there. We're going to zoom in on Kupiansk here, which is somewhat away from the front line, but that is still within artillery range. So Kupiansk does get hit quite often. We're going to go to Syriac maps first of all, just to show. Well, actually, no. Let's go to ISW. It says right. A Russian mill blogger claimed that battles near Hranikivka are ongoing, and that Russian forces established control over Dvorichna with an A. Right, okay, let's zoom in here. So you've got Kupiansk down there, you've got Sinkivka, and we'll talk about that in a second, Liman Pershi, Horobivka, and then as we zoom in, Hranikivka and Dvorichna and Dvorichne. So the E, Dvorichne ending in E seems to be under Russian control now. That has been recently taken, or at least there are claims about it being taken. Even that's not 100%. But there's the old claim about Dvorichne, but it appears that even the Russian mill bloggers could be getting that confused with Dvorichne, as ISW goes on to say. The Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces completely captured Dvorichne on February the 10th, and it is possible that this military blogger has confused the two settlements. And it goes on to sort of discuss that a little bit in further depth, and says actually they've got ISW has no visual confirmation that Dvorichne has been taken. If we go on to Syriac maps, a pro-Russian mapper, it says the situation on northeast front, Ukrainians withdrew from Hranikivka. However, the Russian didn't enter into the remaining parts of it, the remaining parts out of its control, but troops are advancing at the outskirts. So this map says Hranikivka, that the Ukrainians are withdrawing in two directions from there, but the Russians have only made sort of marginal advances around there. I have on my map, I've pretty much gone with that. I think that appears to be sort of backed up by most sources. But still, the ISW is saying, well, we haven't yet got full confirmation Dvorichne has fallen. But yeah, I imagine that could well be the case. Poulet Volant here goes along with that as well, saying, Hranikivka has sort of half controlled by the Russians, but it could be that they would march further in and take the whole of that settlement, and they have Dvorichne there. Sinkivka here has had claims about whether it is controlled by Russians or not. In fact, ISW are great. Sometimes they go, right, we're going to recode a bunch of stuff because we've got information that's in, and we got that wrong based on evidence that we're using from these people. So in fact, Sinkivka, the claims were again Russian claims. They were saying, well, we think Sinkivka might be under Russian control because of these Russian claims. There's nothing to do with Ukrainians being inaccurate here. This is okay. We were listening to the Russians, and then now we've seen that those same Russians are saying that that place is being shelled, as we see from Rybar. So Sinkivka, let's first of all show you where Sinkivka is. So we come a little bit further down south here. The idea is Sinkivka was taken, as according to some claims, Rybar were one of them. Well, now Rybar is saying, in the Kupiansk sector, the Russian forces have consolidated their positions in the area of Dvorichne and Sinkivka. Artillery strikes continue. Okay, so you're talking about artillery, and you're talking about like vague claims of control. The Ukrainians are accumulating reserves and increasing logistical capabilities around Kupiansk itself. But no one else seems to make big claims about Sinkivka. Sinkivka's in Poulet Volant's map has not been taken, and so the ISW says, okay, we're recoding it, and Sinkivka is actually, claims as a Ukrainian counter-offensives over Sinkivka. So they're claiming that actually Ukrainians could have taken that back rather than it being under Russian control. Who knows? Either it was under Russian control, it's been taken back, or it never was under Russian control, and they're just shelling it. So Rybar claimed that Russian forces struck Ukrainian positions in Sinkivka today. So that means that I'm pretty safe to say it's under Ukrainian control at the moment. But there were, as you heard in the news today, there are reports that the Russians are perhaps mounting an offensive in the area, that they've got in dribs and drabs artillery one by one to around here, and rather than in one big fell swoop, because then there'd be prime targets for artillery if you saw a convoy of towed artillery being brought here, or SPGs. But if you bring them in sort of singles, one and then another and then another, then you suddenly have an amassed accumulation of material. It could be that Kupiansk is becoming increasingly an area where the Russians might be putting on something of a more major offensive. As we come further down south, not really much to report. Nothing coming out of Kuzmivka and Novoselivska. We come down towards Kreminna, and remember, this appears to be where either the Russians are carrying out an offensive now or are doing a pre-offensive offensive, whatever that is. Russian forces continued offensive operations in the Kreminna area. Yep. So Kreminna, Shepelove, I think that's Shiplivka. They apparently have made some marginal advances west of Shiplivka and Belorivka. So the other important thing, geolocated footage published on February the 10th indicates Russian forces likely secured marginal force advances west of Shiplivka. A Russian military blogger claimed that Russian forces conducted an assault from Dubrova. Okay, let's see what Defmon has to say. The Ukrainians repulsed attacks in the area of Shiplivka and Belorivka. Most reports seem to indicate the attacks in the Shiplivka area are located north of the river. So, okay, we've got attacks from out of Kreminna, from Dubrova. There are supposedly attacks from Dubrova towards Zarichne, towards Torska and Yampelivka up in this area. And then attacks to the west of Shiplivka, and this is where ISW think that Russia may have made some marginal advances. Defmon says it's north of this Sversky Donetsk river. Let's put that on my map. Okay, so we've got Kreminna. We come down to Shiplivka, and there's Belorivka here. There's the Sversky Donetsk river, and it could be around this area north of the river where the Russians are making some kind of advances. Of course, that they may want to do some kind of encirclement of Belorivka, but the river kind of gets in the way of making that an easy thing to do. So there's a good natural defense of the river there that helps to defend Belorivka. Just to give you an idea of the topography of the area, you've got Belorivka here and some heights behind there. and the Russians are attacking from here, and north of the Seversky Donetsk River, they are making some marginal gains there. So, but it's going to be difficult for them to try and encircle Bilorivka from that direction, given that the river is a major obstacle, certainly for mechanized equipment. So I think this is a fairly good place for the Ukrainians to be defending, and there are some claims that it's been really difficult for the Russians, and they have lost some amount of equipment there. Poulet Volon's map here says pretty much the same thing. Pressure all along those areas. But we're now going to move to the Bakhmut area where there is some fairly significant news. So let's pop down south. I haven't heard much about Verkhnokamianka and Mianska, the other side. Haven't heard much about Shpiona and Brestova or even this Bilorivka. It's certainly all about Krasnohora. There are some claims that Wagner are taking some territory in this northern little village near called Sakio Vansetti. Here, Sakio Vansetti. That's according to Rebar. Let's go to Rebar, see what they say. Fierce fighting continues near Bakhmut. Russian forces' efforts are focused on capturing Krasnohora and Perpetua north of Bakhmut, continuing the advance near Sakio Vansetti on the right bank of the Bakhmutivka, and physically cutting off the road to Shaziv Yar. That's in another place. Wagner assault group, supported by regular Russian units, effectively closed the encirclement ring around the 54th Airview Brigade, defending in the ruined village of Krasnohora. Interesting that the Rebar is admitting that there is Wagner and regular Russian units. In fact, it seems like Wagner are operating more to the south of Bakhmut and regular Russian units to the north. The Ukrainian Solidar troop group is unable to rotate and remove personnel from Krasnohora, says Rebar, the pro-Russian source. One enemy company escaped from the front lines, suffering irreparable losses. They are considering sending assault troops, but have not done for the risk of wasting troops. The Russian assault groups are being targeted by enemy army aviation. Ukrainian Mi-8s and Mi-24s have been engaged from an airfield in Mirny in the west of Donetsk. Aircraft were redirected from Vuhledar and Marinka to Bakhmut. There has been lots of footage of them doing their sort of nose up, firing off rockets. These are somewhat inaccurate because they are just ballistic rockets, right? And you've got to get the angle right, let them off, and hope that they, the trajectory gets it to the right place. So it's not as good as obviously guided munitions, but there you go. There's a lot of activity of that with the Ukrainians. Seen a lot of that recently. So let's have a look at this area of Perpetua and Krasnohora. So we go to Poulet Volon's map because it's fairly clear. We can see that Perpetua up here and Krasnohora here. So Krasnohora was this little enclave that was still under Ukrainian control, and that it seems to have finally fallen. If we look at there's some footage. Where do we have it? Right, so Wagner standing by the sign to Krasnohora and showing that they at least control, around where that sign is. But it certainly looks like they have control over that now. If we come down south here, we can see that from my map, this was the area that the Ukrainians originally controlled. That is now under Russian control, and the Ukrainians have pulled out of there. Syriac Maps has this as a representation. So the Ukrainians are pulling out back into Perpetua. There are some claims that the Russians are increasing their territory in the southeast of Perpetua. So that's going to be down in this area, as they now can concentrate on putting pressure on Perpetua. The ISW says Russian forces continue defensive operations around Bakhmut on the 11th. Ukrainian spokesperson Cherevati stated that there were 39 combat operations between Russian and Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut in the past 24 hours, and the Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled Russian assaults near Bakhmut, Krasnohora. Yeah, I think they've lost that, and Ivanivska. Geolocated footage published on the 11th shows Russian forces walking freely in the eastern part of Krasnohora, and likely indicates the Ukrainian forces withdrew from that settlement. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces encircled Ukrainian forces in Krasnohora, and that Wagner group fighters currently hold positions in the southeastern part of Perpetua. So Yeah, it not looking good for the Ukrainians there, but that was on the cards, has been on the cards the last few days. Defmon originally said, repulsed attacks in the area of Krasnohora, so that's saying what the general staff of the Ukrainians were saying, but then said recently Russians have been trying to advance towards the N03 highway along this way from Bladatne. I don't think they have much success. Krasnohora is most likely completely lost at this point. So there's your Krasnohora being lost. And then it's this he doesn't have them as far as some other mappers. Some other mappers have the Ukrainians across this road. ISW includes that claim, even though it doesn't necessarily say it's true. It says that this is the claim that some Russian sources have, that they've crossed that road. But where they have it in red, they're more sure, and they include Krasnohora now. So there is this kind of maybe big grey zone over here. I've not gone so far as the biggest claim to the Russians, which is that they're over here. I think this is probably realistic at the moment, but we shall see. Pressure is now going to be on Paraskevivka because that is effectively surrounded from this salient coming from the north here from the Russians. However, you could say that the Russians are in some sense surrounded in this kind of little bridgehead there. So you don't know. The Ukrainians could put on a counterattack that comes down here and cuts them off, but I don't know what the capability of the Ukrainians are. Rebar makes claims that they're using a lot more untrained conscripts in Bakhmut at the moment. Again, how true is that? Difficult to say. Here is their claim. Foreign mercenaries operating near Bakhmut, that's basically foreign volunteer regiments, are mainly occupying the second or third lines of defense. Young recruits mobilizing territorial defense units occupy the defense in the first lines. This sounds very much like they're projecting the Wagner claims onto the Ukrainians here. The use of untrained and inexperienced recruits makes it possible to temporarily fill up the front with cannon fodder, in scare quotes, slowing the advance of the Russian troops and buying time for deliveries of relatively modern equipment from the West. It could be what's happening, I don't know, but it also sounds very much like, well, I know what you're saying about Russian convict recruits for Wagner. Well, we can say that about you as well. So I don't know what the exact truth is there, but take that with a pinch of salt. Possibly. We have claims that a bridge on the T0504 near the town of Ivaniska was reportedly destroyed by Russian artillery strikes. You can see that here. That is obviously going to affect supplies into Bakhmut somewhat. However, that is a T0504. I'll just point that out to you. As we zoom out, come back down, Ivanivska is here. You've got the T0504, and the bridge might be a bridge over the canal there. It could be another bridge. I don't know what other bridges there are around there, but probably somewhere around here. Now, thing is that road wouldn't have been used. I don't think. It's either been compromised further to the west, or it's just under fire control. So, but it definitely can't be used now, and that will be a problem going forward. If the Ukrainians were to do some kind of counterattack around here, then they wouldn't be able to use that road without fixing it up. I just want to return back to the northeastern area. So there's been some geolocated footage. ISW talk about this, of an area in Stupki, which is in this northeastern suburb of Bakhmut, that has been recaptured by the Ukrainians. So that's not to say they're losing everywhere. And there are some claims to say that they are reinforcing Bakhmut. Bakhmut is not being given up. You might see a long-term defense of this. It depends on what goes on the eastern front here, but again, not too much information there. Just to give you a sense of what's going on from Poulet-Volant's map, so you've got the pressure all around the eastern areas, but there's been no real information out of the last 24 hours about what's going along there. Well, last 48 hours has actually been fairly dry in terms of information, and in the south as well from Pitny going in that northerly direction. If you come and look around the Ivaniska area, Poulet-Volant's map doesn't have the Ukrainians the Russians at the T0504 highway there, where I do. That was based on, I think, Syriac maps and other sort of Russian sources over the last few days, saying that they are making inroads into Stopochki So that's why I kept my blue Ukrainian line there, because I'm not 100% sure that is the case. And Poulet Volant thinks obviously that it's not, that they are restricted to that canal still, and they are explicitly on the east of the canal. I'm not 100% sure that is the case. As you can see, that I have them to the west of the canal by some distance in all along that sort of more northerly area there. So the canal comes down here. Anyway, we shall see. But that's what you have for Bakhmut at the moment. Just before I go down to Avdivka, I do want to mention something that the ISW discusses. So we're talking previously about how from north of Bakhmut, you've got this area that the Russians have been advancing in, albeit slowly, north of Soledar towards Seversk, and talking about like how the Russians would really want to take Seversk, and to do that they'd have to come north from here, but also southwest from Bilorivka, in this direction, and then also from the east, Verkhnokamayanka as well. Well, the ISW says Russian forces are highly unlikely to launch a coordinated effort to capture Siversk in the coming weeks, contrary to previous claims from Russian mill bloggers. Prominent Russian mill bloggers recently responded to Wagner Group advances north of Soledar and Russian claims about the capture of Bilorivka, by suggesting that Russian forces were launching a complementary effort to encircle Siversk. ISW assessed that the Russian forces would need to launch a far more concerted effort in the direction of Seversk from the north, east, and south to drive on the settlement. ISW has observed the Wagner Group's offensive operations north of Soledar have waned in previous days, suggesting that these operations were in the service of the overall Russian effort to encircle Bakhmut and not orientated towards Seversk. Russian mill bloggers have also mentioned a Russian offensive to take Seversk, since Russian claims about the capture of Bilorivka proved to be false. They have not mentioned, sorry, a Russian. So basically, ever since it turned, so the Russians claimed recently that they had captured Bilorivka. That turned out not to be true. But that claim prompted all these claims about Seversk will fall next and you'll get this. And I talked about this, not that it has happened or that it's likely to be successful, but that's what the intention of the Russians would be. And that still would be the intention of the Russians. But it seems that they have somewhat culminated in this area just north of Soledar there, and the Russians are failing to break through Bilorivka. They are trying to go through the forest to the north there, but there's fierce fighting going on here, and we've not heard anything about this area to the east, which would suggest that Seversk is somewhat safe at the moment. It is a bit like an onion there. I've talked about that previously, how in order for Russia to take Seversk, they need to take these places, to the south of there, and these are actually difficult. There's high ground here and here and here, and that means that you've got line of sight and the ability to set your artillery here and ATGMs and whatnot down on this lower ground, which is basically a river valley, if you like, going towards Seversk. So it would be difficult to take Seversk, and it appears that possibly the Russians don't have the force to do that at the moment, despite what claims were in the previous sort of couple of weeks. Anyway, let's move down to Avdivka. Not a lot of news about New York and Toretsk. Right, Avdivka has seen some huge losses, but to the south and to the east and northeast of the town, the satellite town. Now, this road coming down past Kamyanka and to the east of Krasnohorivka has been the scene of quite a bit of fighting recently. In fact, reporting from Ukraine has done a video talking about how the Russians have the high ground the Ukrainians have the high ground to the west of that road, and that has allowed them to have good line of sight on the road, and presents a challenge for the Russians to take territory going westwards. And they have indeed lost an awful lot of troops and equipment in the Kamyanka area as well. So basically, Avdivka has not been good news for the Russians. I suggest you go and watch reporting from Ukraine's video. It has a good sort of analysis on that situation around Kamyanka there. So as we come out, let's have a little look, see what ISW says otherwise. So really, the ISW only says mentions activity going on southwest of Avdivka towards Krasnohorivka and a place called Paraskevivka, another Paraskevivka. Surprise, surprise. So let's move on to Marinka, where and it's worth noting, sorry, that there was mention that General Zaluzhny, who's in charge of the Ukrainian forces, has talked about Marinka and Avdivka being sort of areas of great fighting. So I'm just going to read this, what he says. So Russian forces continue to prioritize offensive operations in Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny told General Mark Milley on February the 11th that Russian forces conduct up to 50 attacks daily in the direction of Donetsk city, so that be around Avdivka, and conduct constant attacks around Bakhmut. Zaluzhny stated that fierce fighting continues around Vuhledar and Marinka, and that Ukrainian forces have managed to regain previously lost positions in Donetsk Oblast. Zaluzhny added that the effective artillery is the key to battlefield successes in these areas of the front line, and noted this requires both weapons and ammunition. And obviously, the implication being we need weapons and ammunition from your good selves. So we look at what Rebar says. Fighting continues in Marinka. After Russian armed forces managed to advance near Druzhby Avenue, Russian artillery is operating on the nearby strongholds and supply routes of the AFU. So not really a lot of detail there. We look at Poulet-Volon's maps coming down from Avdivka, so pressure around Kamyanka, but actually slightly further back than I have them, the Russians that is, and then pressure in all the normal places, down to Marinka, where you have pressure down towards Pobieda, actually just a little bit south of Pobieda, and then it's all about Vuhledar. So really not a great amount of detail coming out about that, although fierce fighting is taking place, and as Zaluzhny says, that's where the fiercest fighting is taking place, as well as at Vuhledar. So Vuhledar again in the news. Just to quickly remind you of the context here. So, and there's been geolocated footage of thermobaric munitions being used on Vuhledar over the last sort of day. So, yeah, that's not unusual. That has been used a number of times on Vuhledar. So this is on the heights. You've got the high-rise buildings in Vuhledar, allowing the Ukrainians to have line of sight on the Russians to the south in Pavlivka and Mykilska. The Russians have been trying to attack in two prongs, but have been hitting their heads against a brick wall, been taken out by Ukrainian mines and Ukrainian artillery that's been particularly accurate around this area, because they can be sighted by people in fighters in Vuhledar, as well as obviously drones and whatnot. The Russians have tried to take these dachas to the southwest and to the east and southeast here. They've been flattened by Russian artillery, and it's just been very difficult. There's just been huge amounts of material lost in the area. I mean, huge amounts of material to the point, and troops, to the point that the Russian military bloggers are now up in arms and calling for the heads of Russian military leaders, ordering this kind of stuff to take place. Tatarigami is a really good source for what's going on in Vuhledar. This thread includes additional details about the Battle of Vuhledar and satellite imagery that helps to understand and visualize the situation better. I had to break this into several parts so I can publish more imagery of Russian losses later, part one. So here is your sort of satellite imagery that he's using to get a sense of what's going on. You can see all the pock marks. There's so much artillery from both sides being used. For the past 2 weeks, the enemy attempted to advance in multiple directions, simultaneously hoping to outflank defenders. The occupiers tried to advance from Pavlivka and Mykilska, as well as the west and east of them, assaulting with the forces of the 155th and 40th Brigades. So Vuhledar's here. You can see all of the artillery fire that's recognizable on this imagery, and that shows where the Russians were advancing, because obviously that's where the Ukrainians were hitting them with intense artillery fire. Then we go on. Battalions from the 36th and 72nd Russian Motor Rifle Brigades tried to advance alongside the 155th and 40th Brigades, but also failed. Special Forces partially lost control when the commander of the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade, Colonel Sergei Polyakov, was killed. And that's something I don't think I reported on, but that happened the other day. And it was pretty significant. You got lots of destroyed vehicles and debris in these sorts of images as well, and we've got lots of video footage of that. What makes the destruction of 155th and 40th brigades especially important? This is not commonly discussed, but on the battlefield, only a small percentage of people participate in the actual assault. Even many combat roles, like artillery, do not face their enemy directly. but this is a scene of, I mean, you can see that how much artillery here. I think what happened with the Dachas is the Ukrainians would have hit the artillery first. So let me go back. When the Russians were attacking, the Ukrainians hit this area with artillery because obviously the Russians were pushing through there on Vuhledar. But then subsequently, apparently, that has been flattened by Russian artillery. So sorry, get my memory sorted out there. He continues, not that many people are fit to be in the forward vanguard assault groups that face an enemy first. It takes a lot of experience, courage, and stimulants to attack and act effectively when you know your chances to be killed or wounded in the assault are almost 90%. Here are the vehicle sort of graveyards. So we got 2, 4, 6, 8 vehicles in that one image alone. The backbone of the 155th and 40th Brigades consisted of sergeants and officers who were ready to execute any order, whether it was a risky frontal assault or execution of civilians in Bucha and Irpin, where the 155th Brigade committed war crimes. And again, we have more destroyed vehicles here, another 6 vehicles. After staggering casualties of the VDV, that's Airborne Forces, in the battle for Kyiv, it took them a year to restore assault capabilities, partially which we can see in the Kreminna area. It will take as long for Marines to restore assault capacities, especially after catastrophic failure. So again, the 155th and 40th will really suffer what they're suffering now, and to reconstitute those forces effectively will take a very long time. Ukraine achieved this success due to a combination of factors: good planning, selection of positions, bravery of soldiers, intel, and smart utilization of scarce resources. Both to project the Vuhledar experience on the whole war, we need much more ammo and weapons. I'm planning to publish imagery of infamous armored vehicle columns in the coming weeks. If you don't want to miss it, make sure to follow and retweet. So that's check out Tatarogami. He does have a lot of stuff on Vuhledar. It's been pretty terrible there. Anyway, as we come out of Vuhledar and go towards the west to the Zaporizhia Oblast and Kherson, apparently the water level of the reservoir is dropping because when the Russians pulled out in the Kherson offensive, they opened the sluice gates and I think damaged stuff. So the water is dropping, but the worry is that it's getting to dangerously low levels for the nuclear power plant that uses the water there for its cooling systems. So there is a bit of a threat to that going on. That needs to be looked at. Ukrainian officials reporting that Russian forces are continuing to accumulate on the eastern bank of the Dnipro, although that's not for an offensive, more likely for sort of control, as it says here, not preparing for an offensive, but bringing in manpower to support law enforcement activities. So I don't think there's too much else to report of this area, and indeed, you know, of other things going on. Not really heard any details of any HIMARS strikes, though they will be taking place on a nightly basis, as I'm sure you are aware. Anyway, thank you so much. That's the end of the Frontline update. Please like, subscribe, and share. I might be able to get an extra out later. I don't know. It's Sunday. Things happen. But if I don't, you know, I'll speak to you tomorrow. If I do, I'll speak to you later. Thanks for all your help. Take care. Doodle pips.